Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us for this Hopkins Hour, which is a conversation about early inclusive education. My name is David Trembath, and I'll be, taking us through the next hour with involvement of our amazing guests. But before we begin, I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the different lands on which we're meeting today. So for me, that's the Kumba people, speakers of the Yugambeh language. I pay my respect to elders, past and present, and extend that deep respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So in a moment, I'll introduce the session and the speakers, but before I do, there are a few housekeeping items to address. We're aware that internet connections will vary in the online environment, and so if you experience any technical difficulties, please feel free to put a question into the chat via the toolbar at the top of your screen, and one of our events team will do their best to assist you if and where they can. If needed, you can leave the Teams event platform that we're on at any time and return to it without losing your place. You can turn on captions via your Teams meetings settings. Please feel welcome to have cameras on or off and during the call. Please use the chat function to ask questions at any time throughout the session. So you can select the chat function from the navigation bar at the top. What we'll be doing is we'll be having a conversation and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, and where I see questions or comments, we'll attempt to weave those into the conversation. If we run out of time, or if it makes more sense to keep them together, we'll look at them at the end. But we really would warmly welcome questions and comments. Okay, so in terms of this session and an overview, what we're trying to do is two main things. The first is for colleagues joining us today who are interested in early childhood education and inclusion. This is a chance to hear from two amazing colleagues who work in this space, Mel and Fran, who I'll introduce in a moment, each bringing a wealth of insight and experience. For people who are joining who want to learn more about the collaboration between Sanctuary Early Learning Adventure and Griffith University, we hope this will be a valuable first step in understanding a little bit more about the partnership and where it's heading and how to learn more and get involved. We've structured primarily as a conversation, and so we plan to cover a few topics, but also allow enough room for it to flow. We'll have hopefully a brief overview of Sanctuary Early Learning Adventure and the collaboration, a chat about sort of the experience of early inclusive education for children and families and some of the issues in the field, the opportunities as well as the challenges, and also begin to explore some of the opportunities that come through the collaboration. As I mentioned, please ask questions and comments at any time. So let's get started. And to do so, I'm delighted to welcome our two guests today. So we have Melissa Taylor-Hansford from Sanctuary Early Learning Adventure within the Health and Knowledge Precinct, and Professor Fran Press, Dean and Head of School of Education and Professional Studies at Griffith University. To get us started, I might ask Mel, would you mind perhaps giving us a brief introduction to Sanctuary, including the new centre in the Gold Coast Health and Knowledge Precinct? Sorry, Mel, just your mic.
We're off to a great start. Thank you for having me, David, and thank you, Fran, for also having me on this chat today. So I'll just introduce you to Sanctuary as a company first. So Sanctuary are a family-owned and operated service that has 6 centres across Queensland. Our latest service that's come on board is our Health and Knowledge Precinct site, which is located in the Proxima building, quite close to the university and the hospital. So we're in a multi-storey building with the capacity to have up to 171 children in our care every day. I'll just go to the next slide, if that's all right. One of the exciting things about having a new service is thinking about what we could do here differently. And this has been a 5-year collaboration with Economic Development Queensland, with our company, but also lots of other partners who have helped us think about the design and the delivery of the service that we're offering at the Health and Knowledge Precinct. So it's been a long collaboration that has come to fruition recently. This service has been open for just 5 weeks. So it's lovely actually to have children in the space. Just the next slide, please. One of the things that's really interesting and what makes Sanctuary Health and Knowledge Precinct different is the amount of thought that's gone into ensuring that it's a long day care setting with a really inclusive lens. And by inclusive lens, we've thought about things from the design, but also through to the practice. So some of the design elements that you may note is that we've designed accessible playground areas. We have dedicated sensory or retreat rooms. We ensure that there's no transitions for children throughout the building so that children who use walkers or wheelchairs are able to move freely indoors, outdoors and throughout the play spaces. We have visual, fire and lockdown signs for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. And we have really 4 different lighting options in every classroom for children who may have sensory sensitivities. The textures and paint, flooring throughout the service create a calm setting with continuity, and even thinking about the acoustic elements within each space. So we're really excited to be able to partner with the university with our collaboration agreement and think about how we can be part of partnerships that elevate and experiment with inclusive and innovative practice so we can support children, families and educators. And that's it, David.
Thanks, Mel. Your words there, elevate, and all for the benefit ultimately of kids and families and in collaboration with those who support them really strike me. And within the university, we care a lot about partnerships, right? We know that the most impactful work generally happens in partnership with people, organisations and other groups within the community. So here's a great opportunity, but partnerships require a lot of thought and care in order for them to work really well for the kids, the families, those around them, and then ultimately the people involved. Fran, you have an enormous amount of experience with partnerships. Can I ask you to share some of your thoughts around this partnership? And yeah.
Thanks, David. I was really pleased to hear Mel explain how the clarity of purpose for what this centre would be has influenced the design from the get-go in what would happen for children. So the slide that I've got up here, it might seem a bit left field to participants, but it's born of my long history of working in the area of early childhood education and care policy, but also in a series of research projects I did around interprofessional practice for inclusion in early childhood education and care. And this policy hasn't been, this slide hasn't been developed for this presentation, but I'm drawing on it because I think it captures in early childhood education and care generally some of the competing policy imperatives that impact what actually happens for children and families within the service. So in the middle, you can see the early childhood education and care service, but why are these services funded and why do families access them? For a long time, the system has been predominantly funded to enable the workforce participation of parents. So although this has changed in the last, say, 15 years, for many years, policy and practice was driven by the amount of places you could provide for children to come to a service, with less attention perhaps on what was happening for children within the service. There's also been a lot of rhetoric around having early childhood education and care as a platform for school readiness, so that when children commence school, they will benefit, they're more likely to benefit from their school education. And this is pretty much an objective that's been supported by many years of research. In Australia, we have a mixed economy of early childhood education and care provision. Sanctuary is a private provider. So another thing that will affect what happens in services is, what does a business need to do to be viable financially as well as attractive for people to come to that service? On the other side of the circle, there's a lot of discussion, particularly within the early childhood educator and professional community, about what does it mean to create a childcare or early childhood program that is really child-centred, that's based on the creation of beautiful and respectful spaces for children, where we might think about the role of education in building a democratic civil society, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But also down the bottom, I put early intervention and prevention. So we all know that the earlier that we work with children and families to address their concerns, to mitigate the disadvantages that they might be facing, whether that's something that children are born with or the circumstances in which they are living, the more effective that early intervention is meant to be, will be. And I think one of the opportunities that this partnership enables us to do is to really interrogate what is the best practice around early intervention and prevention in a way that is respectful of children and children's rights, because that's certainly the driver that drives my practice in this area. I guess in sharing this slide, one thing I am saying is that those tensions are alive in a service at any point in time. And depending on what is prioritised, it will pull practice in certain directions. And that's something I think we might be able to explore through our conversation today. Could we have the next slide? I just wanted to share a couple of quotes or excerpts that are really driven from the policy frameworks within early childhood education and care. This slide comes from the second Starting Strong report, which is the OECD Comparative Policy Reports for Early Childhood Education. And one of their recommendations for early childhood education was that we should have systems that support broad learning, participation, children's participation and democracy. And that within the service, what we're really hoping for children is that they're learning to be. So children exist in the present. Their experiences in the present are just as important as what we think they are going to become. Learning to do, learning to learn, and learning to live together. And if we move to the next slide, I just wanted to share Article 29D from the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. And that is that the education of the child shall be directed to the preparation of the child for responsible life in a free society, in the spirit of understanding, peace, tolerance, equality of the sexes, and friendship among all peoples, ethnic, national and religious groups and persons of Indigenous origin. And I can't help thinking of the state of the world that we're living in today, how important it is to really have a philosophical grounding in why we have early childhood programs, why we have schools that enable us to place our inclusive practices in a broader context. And that's going to be an interesting discussion when we unpack some of the tensions that might be alive when we try and look at inclusive practices in programs. So thank you for indulging me with that little philosophical introduction, but I thought it might be a useful framework for our conversation later on.
It's incredibly helpful. Thanks, Fran. Mel, does it resonate with you? Are there elements there or all of it? Or yeah.
Yes, I think it was lovely to hear Fran talk about the notion of being. Our early years learning framework has 3 core drivers, which is belonging, for children to feel belonging, for them to be. So belonging, being, and then becoming are the drivers of our early childhood curriculum. So absolutely what Fran said resonated. The other thing that I really picked up on was thinking about this notion of a responsible life. And it actually really feeds into part of our philosophy, which is high expectations for all children, and oftentimes in settings where people are endeavouring to have an inclusive environment, and sometimes that comes with low expectations for children. And so being able to have high expectations and think about that being responsible into your life after your early childhood experience absolutely talks to what we try and do at Sanctuary.
And if I could just jump in there, David, I think a nice branching off that is that inclusive practice and high expectations and responsibility are just not about the individual life, but how we are responsible for one another. And part of the inclusive practice, I think, is recognising the importance to the child of things like their friendships and their communities within that setting, that they're more than their diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. Mel, that's a really interesting comment. Diagnosis, Mel, versus dimensional view of development and inclusion and so forth. Yeah, do you have any thoughts around that?
I think what we try and do, and Fran also spoke around this, is, hold the child at the centre of everything we do, and again, the child not being defined by their diagnosis, because we really subscribe to a social and humanistic model of disability in our services. So we understand the need for our clinical colleagues to work with us around shaping interventions and shaping treatments and methodologies to help children. But we also all recognise that all children are valued within this environment, and that they are more than their diagnosis, and that ability to be just who they are. Whatever the diagnosis looks like, and for our educators to be really cognizant in examining their own bias and thinking about how they view disability and have children at the centre of their practice has been a piece of work that we've really tried to instill in our educators here at the Health and Knowledge Precinct, and that will then work out to our other services down the track.
You mentioned the putting children and families at the centre, and it's one of the first things that really struck me in having conversations with Sanctuary and the team, and including Lauren and Damien as directors, and the broader group, and obviously with you, Mel. And I remember early on learning about the waterfall approach that you adopt within Sanctuary. I'm happy to talk a little bit about that when it comes to decision making and, within centres.
Well, I think what we try and do is have really positive impact for each individual child and family that attends the service. So our decision making, and this is an interesting tension that Fran has alluded to in her beautiful diagram, is around making decisions on behalf and alongside children and families that have the best interest of those individual children at heart. And sometimes they're not the most viable business decisions. And what we're lucky with here at Sanctuary is we are a private business. There's no two ways about that, but we have a social conscience. And we actually want to look at working alongside our partners and our families with that social framing in mind. So when we do good work across all of our services, that means that if some children need additional support, we can do that for them. So but this notion of being able to, you know, it's a luxury to be able to have a family-owned business where you can ask the directors, can I just pay for an extra person? Because we really need some addition. And because of the social conscious and the dedication and this passion for what we're doing here, they just say, yep, do what you need to do to make sure that that child and family are well supported within our service. So I hope I've answered the question correctly, but I think it is around making sure that from the top we all have this this child and family at the centre of the practice.
It seems like a really helpful, important, critical kind of foundation for the collaboration in my mind. There's going to be lots of decisions to make, lots of opportunities to consider, etc. And if that can be our compass, our North Star, you know, I think that's going to be really important. Fran, you have helped us to see all of the different kind of factors or components or competing, you know, interests and whatnot. When it works well, when early childhood education and care works well, what have you seen it mean for kids and for families and communities?
Well, I think when the system works well, one, it's accessible and affordable and families can get there. But I think once you get to a service and it works well, I think there are a few things that that mark a good service. I think one is that both families and children feel safe and a sense of belonging in that service. They don't feel that they have to wait at the door or, you know, intimidated to talk to their educators and partners, that they're actually actively engaged in conversations about their children and what is happening. So I think there's a sense of belonging for children and families. I think there's a lot of trust where families can both disclose concerns that they might have, either about what might be happening in the service or concerns about their children or other stresses in their lives, because all families at some time or another will probably reach a point where there's a difficulty in their parenting or with their child that they're not sure how to deal with. So I think in a good child and family focused service, there's opportunities to have those conversations and at least find out where you can seek additional support. I think when it comes to inclusive education, it's what works really well is if families don't have to repeat their conversations with many different providers of support, but there's a conduit where there's a much more integrated and team approach to providing support for children and families, and that there's a congruence in what an allied health professional, for instance, might do and what educators might do, but also that there's very often challenging and sometimes different but mutually respectful conversations about what the right thing is to do. So just riffing off what Mel was saying before, sometimes people will have very different views about what the child's best interests are in a particular situation, and that requires some rigorous discussion where people are open to other people's perspectives. And I also think that for children, we want an environment that acknowledges their right to participate in the decisions that affect them, that they have voice in that situation, that that even though they are young, their agency is recognised and they have influence on their environment. But the things that, if you look at the Productivity Commission's report on early childhood education and care, which has just come out, they have two reports there, one from children in early childhood settings and one based with children in outside school hours care settings, where they're talking to children about what they value. And what really comes to the fore when you look at those reports is their friendships, the friendships that they have in their setting, the connections that they have with their educators, and their love for their families. So those connections, I think, have to be evident and respected within an early childhood program. And I mean, I could talk about quality indicators in early childhood education and care, but you can all get on the ASEQA website and look that up. But I think that sense of belonging, of trust, of respecting children's voices and families' voices, of partnership are really important. And I think that, as Mel said, what I would call is a good play-based learning environment, where it's clear that educators know about the interests and strengths and challenges facing each of those children and build upon them. And I'll stop because we'll talk about this for ages. Couldn't you, Mel?
Yeah, Mel, what are your thoughts?
Oh, so many. I love listening to Fran, because then my mind just starts thinking about what it does look like. And for us, again, I think thinking about children's rights, and again, Fran's already alluded to that. All children have the right to good quality early childhood education and care. That has to be the premise of what we do. And again, I'm going to go back to this high expectations. All children have the right to be as successful as they can individually be in their early learning and development. And it's that Vygotskian theory around understanding where children are at and then stretching them just a little, the zone of proximal development for lots of children, thinking about that. For us, what good quality looks like is being transparent, open and honest around what our commitment to inclusion is and where perhaps we may not be able to include a child in the program. And this is an interesting tension that we find in all education settings. And I think I've come to a realisation that this transparency and speaking with families candidly and saying, look, our plan is that we'll include your child right from the outset. We're going to do everything that we possibly can. The tension only comes, and I'd be talking to you about it, and I say this to families, the tension for me comes when the child's not benefiting from being in this environment. If this environment is one that we've made all our adjustments, we're working with our partners and we're doing everything possible, but if the child's not flourishing or they're not getting anything out of being here, perhaps we're not the right fit. And, not all children can be in a group of 19. Not all children can be a baby in a baby's room. And we recognise that. But I think the shift for me has been, and this is a maturation of my own processes and leadership, is being confident to say, if we find that the fit is not right and we've worked together and we've done everything we can, our commitment to you is that we'll help you find somewhere that is a right fit for your child. Because I think this notion of children, sort of being excluded and, it's horrific. And we know from the data that if children are excluded in early childhood settings, then they're often excluded in, primary and secondary settings. So it's not our aim ever to not succeed, but I also want to put the child at the centre of the decision making. And so this is a tension, but I think I feel in an open and honest and transparent approach with families that we're not going to overpromise and underdeliver, and we're going to keep the child's benefit at the centre of our decision making, not everyone else's benefit, if that makes sense.
It really strikes me, in talking with you, Mel, around all of the connections that you're forming in the community. So different organisations and other providers, and providers that cater have different offerings, and you talk about the family sort of wraparound and support model and working with children and families and helping them not just within the service, but also more broadly know what's out there, navigate that and make those connections where relevant. So you're saying now fits really nicely within that in my mind that, you're presenting as one option, but more importantly, you're presenting a map of all of the options through that process. Fran, what's on your mind? What are your thoughts?
Oh, well, I was just wanting to underscore a point that Mel was making. I think inclusion is more than being present. And I think too often in lazy educational settings, inclusion is about a child being in the classroom, whether or not they have a sense of belonging in that classroom, whether they have friends in that classroom, whether they're benefiting from that classroom. Inclusion takes work. So I think Mel's made a really good point there. But I also want to say, always I shudder to think that children are excluded from early childhood programs. I think that's a really appalling state to have come to. That's not a critique of what your service is doing, Mel. That's just the issue generally. Yeah.
No, and actually, interestingly enough, currently we're supporting 2 families, one of whom have been excluded from a clinical early childhood setting and one of whom has been excluded from school. And so we have a little man already who has had not a great go at prep this year, who's finishing up the year with us to try again next year. So, you know, we are really open to everyone who presents to us, but we're also realistic around that benefit to children because, as you said, a child sitting in a corner not being able to, you know, participate in a program or, you know, it isn't inclusion. So we want to be really clear on what it is and what it isn't.
I think that also speaks to, Mel, the need for the way educators, teachers, educators, support people are really geared with the knowledge to take a much more child-centred approach rather than expecting. I mean, it's a big ask, I think, particularly at school, right? There's such a developmental range in those early years. You might be 5 and you might see a range of different behaviours. To think that all children are going to be at a particular stage or way of being when they enter, it's just unrealistic. We really have to change the mindsets around those things, I think.
And this goes back to your systems change issue around this continuity from birth, you know, birth to the graveyard, like this system that we have in place that sometimes has these big disconnects in practice.
I'm always fascinated by kind of like the mechanisms. Like, are there mechanisms for change where if you do this, it'll have like a cascading effect on a whole lot of other things. So you get a really big outcome for a more relatively smaller investment of energy or time or resources versus other mechanisms, which may be important and valuable, but they don't have that bigger effect. I'd love to ask about that. Just a note, I'm looking at people in the call today. There's some incredible experience and expertise and insights in the group. Please share just even your reflections. I'd love to hear your reflections on what Mel and Fran are talking about, as well as any questions or suggestions for things that you'd love them to talk to. But going back to that idea of mechanisms and so forth, I've heard words like belonging and trust and partnership, being transparent and open and honest, and I see some of those as like outcomes or characteristics, but also probably mechanisms by which inclusion can be supported. I just wonder if we kind of distill it down, are there any kind of, in your experience, just really kind of key mechanisms for supporting inclusion, things that if you change it here, you know, such as attitudes or something like that, that it then has this cascading, beautiful cascading effect in other areas. Yeah, Fran, do you have any thoughts on that?
I have some initial thoughts. It's interesting that you said about attitudes. This wasn't specifically targeted at inclusive programs, but we did look at some very high quality early childhood education and care programs. And one thing that really seemed to drive the quality of the programs was they had very clear philosophies. They had a very clear vision about what they wanted to achieve and why. That was grounded in an understanding of, you know, children and etc. But it wasn't kind of the practices weren't random. They had a very clear reference point for why they were making certain decisions about their curriculum, the answer to difficult ethical situations, etc. So I think that notion of being clear about why you're in the game and what you want to achieve, and to me it should be around children and families, it's not for some other reason, it is critically important. But the other thing is, I think Mel is in a fortunate position. She said sometimes they can bring in extra staff, etc. When we have looked at really impactful programs around inclusion, time has been a factor. You know, being able to employ staff who can build the relationships with families. And I'm not going to talk about disability here. I'm just going to share a story from a research project that we had with refugee families, or of a service that worked with refugee families who weren't coming to the service. So these were in areas of high disadvantage, and families weren't accessing the service. They really had to employ staff who could be cultural brokers, who understood the culture of that refugee community, who could build trust with that community, who could inform the educators about how certain things like disability were viewed culturally, as opposed to how we might view them from a very Western, clinical standpoint. There really had to be a lot of bridge building between the service, and they ended up catering exceedingly well to this community and to many of the children, many of whom had multiple high needs that educators had to work with. But time and responsiveness, time to understand, time to think and respond was critical for the practices to be effective, for trust to be built, for the community to feel safe, for the children to feel safe within that service. So I think time is a really important gift that we can give to educators to build those links with families. Just to let you know, for people that don't work in early childhood education and care, the educator's work is typified by extremely high levels of multitasking and task switching. So if you look at what an educator does in an hour, they are doing multiple things, often at once and in very short time frames, because they're following interests of children, they're looking after groups of children, they're doing lots of things at once. It's not typical. It's not a typical work pattern. That means if you want to have the time for deep conversations to go out into the community, that's another layer of stuff that you need to do. But it's absolutely vital. Or if I wanted to talk to you, David, about how you approach your work with this child, I need time to sit down with you and explain what I'm seeing in the classroom with that child, as opposed to what you might be seeing through a diagnosis. So time, I think, is critically important.
Thank you, Fran. And Sarah asked a question, can you provide more specific examples of how you've supported those that may require a lot of extra support in an inclusive way? And I think you've just gone right to the heart of that, Fran. Mel, thoughts?
Would you like me to talk to Sarah's
yeah, would you mind? Actually, that's a great idea.
Yeah, I think that specifically at Sanctuary Health and Knowledge Precinct, we're looking at our family model of support as well. And sometimes we're supporting children through supporting the families. And if we have families and children at the centre of our practice, then and we do have families who perhaps are having children who are on a diagnostic pathway or have a disability, or perhaps there's just some developmental difference or concerns, then part of our work is to help families navigate that. That's a really scary and big thing for families to navigate. And oftentimes comes with this intersectionality of disability and culture that Fran was talking about. And not only, cultural understandings of what disability means to the wider family, there's so much to unpack, and we're in a luxurious position here at Health and Knowledge Precinct that I can work directly with families on behalf of educators and become that conduit to information. So the support is bespoke for individuals, and sometimes it's as simple as ensuring that all educators across the service have language mechanisms that they use with particular children, that child requires you to ask things in a particular way, and other times it will be, things that are, much more, I suppose, you're thinking about disability. There could be medication, or there could be, certain times of the day where children need to be doing particular things. So we really look at each individual, but not only the child, but the family as well. And we're really lucky, though, because we have this amazing environment that, all children at some times may require the time to co-regulate, or the time to, have some calming time. Our environment, even for typically developing children, actually facilitates lots of the supports. And so that's an interesting thing to be thinking about as well.
Thanks, Mel. Fran, are you able to see the chat and Rachel's question?
Yeah.
Better comment on policy?
Yeah, I saw Rachel's. Gee, that's a big question, Rachel. My first, the underlying thing is in early childhood education, if you want to make a difference, quality counts, right? So we have a system. Well, I don't even think we have a system, but we have an early childhood education and care landscape that is very variable in the level of quality that children receive. And you can see that if you're familiar with the quality standards body, ASEQA, you can see that by going on the ASEQA website and looking at their reports. So I think the Productivity Commission has recently released its final report on what we might do in relation to improving the system of early childhood education and care. And I think they've made some quite good recommendations. One relates to quality, and that is they want to act on the services that have been not reaching the quality standard over a period of time. They want, give services the time to improve, but if they don't improve, we just shouldn't be funding them anymore. And I totally agree with that. And I think we should be working with all services to uplift the quality. The other thing is that if you look at the analysis that they've done around inclusion and inclusion support, it's the areas of the most disadvantage tend to have the highest need for inclusion support, but they often have the least access to that inclusion support. So we have to really look at both the way inclusion support is funded, but also the mechanisms for finding out who gets where. The other system is we have pockets. Our provision is very unevenly spread. So in some areas you might have the luxury of choice about where you send your child. In other areas, particularly if you're rural or remote or in a lower economic area, you're going to have less choice. And that might mean you also have less choice if you want to use a service about what the quality of that service is for you. So that's an issue. And affordability is something that the Productivity Commission is really trying to address, because of course the cost of provision, we've got free kindy for older children, at least theoretically in Queensland, but we don't, from children from a very young age. So there are things there that require a lot of cooperation between state, territory and federal governments, because they all have a little foot in the door of some form of early childhood education and care provision. If you wanted me to go into the complexity of that, we could do it at another forum, I think. But in terms of schools, I really do think we have to foster systems where the schooling system has much more respectful conversations with the early childhood education system. I don't know if Mel wants to jump in there with her insights, but children don't enter school as if they've not had any experience before they reach school. So, opportunities for schools to learn more deeply. I'm saying this across the board rather than pointing at a particular state or anything, about what early childhood educators know about those children and what they bring and what they might need. So I don't know how many times I've been in contact with services with teachers who are just, their heart sinks when after all their inclusive practice, the child goes to school and all those extra supports and that knowledge about what enables that child to succeed is lost. So we must have better communication channels. And I'm going to get on my high horse here, because I think one thing that drives this is that people don't respect the knowledge of the early childhood educator sufficiently. And I think that unevenness in status and respect is a real problem that we really have to address at a policy level if we want to do the best for children. And many, many years ago, I don't think this happens now, this was decades ago now, I'm getting so old, but I had the privilege of producing the OECD Australian Background Report for the first Starting Strong report, I think, about what the system was like in Australia. And I got to travel to many states and territories and talk about their early childhood system. And in South Australia at that time, I don't think it's like this anymore, but the early childhood section was a very strong part of the Department of Education. And when early childhood programs, preschools, etc., were on school grounds, the director of the program, early childhood program, and the principal had the same status. Now, that is not necessarily how things work out across the board. So we do have to address that issue of status, I think. That's my high horse. I will stop now.
It's, incredible. Such an important point in my mind to make clear. And can I use it as a way of segueing to the final thing that I'd love to just briefly touch on, and that is the partnership and working in a way that is, going back to some of these words, there's trust, it's partnership, it's transparent, it's open, it's honest, it's respectful. And I think, Fran, you've been really effective in the discussions already within the group that's been involved in this, of emphasising how critically important it is. This is a respectful partnership where the expertise of early childhood educators is acknowledged, as is the expertise and the experience that the kids and the families bring to the work, and something that I think we just have to have as foundational to all of our work. In just a couple of minutes each, if that's okay, do you mind sharing, I don't know, feel welcome to take it in your own direction, but your hope for the partnership, or a couple of things that you insist need to be in there, or that are critical that we foster or nurture? Maybe it's things to avoid. What comes to your mind when you're thinking about laying the foundation for a really good partnership? Maybe Fran, and then we'll finish with Mel, and then I'll briefly summarise and we'll wrap up.
Having trouble with my mouse there. Well, for me, I think what the opportunity with this partnership is that Sanctuary as a site for interprofessional work that can benefit the service, it's quite a strong opportunity. What I think is exciting is if we actually acknowledge the complexity of that work, that the fact, outlining all the things that I said before, that we're all going to come in with different sorts of understandings and knowledges that we bring to whatever Sanctuary might be working through. We might all think that we are saying the same thing, but actually when we interrogate it, we're going to be meaning quite different things. That is hard work. And I think there's always a bit of disagreement is a wonderful thing, because it makes us think about issues in new ways and helps us create new knowledge and new ways of being. So I'm hoping that we might be able to work as a professional community within Griffith, etc., from our different disciplinary backgrounds, etc., and with our Sanctuary as an early childhood provider to work with those tensions transparently and creatively and innovatively.
Thanks, Fran. Mel? Just your mic, Mel.
I suppose when I hear you talk, David, about partnerships and what it means to Sanctuary, our four core values of our company is collaboration, respect, connection, and inclusion. And as someone that manages partnerships on behalf of this service, I think they really can drive how our partnerships, work well together. I'm reminded again of the African proverb, it takes a village, and we have complex children and complex families. And I think that we can be vulnerable enough in our own practice to say, I need people in the village to help me do the best that I can do to support children and families. So for me, the partnership is actually activating the village and seeing how our strengths can align to what and our goal is to, as Fran has alluded to be able to be innovative and to have test and trials and fail fast together. Think about things, we think that'll be great and it doesn't work, and that's okay. And one of our core behaviours at this service is to respectfully challenge each other. And I think, again, we could take that along for our journey in partnership to say, let's respectfully challenge. I see the tension, I feel it, but what's going to be the best outcome for children and families, and how we can align our pieces of work for the best outcomes is really key, I think, to having successful partnerships.
Thanks, Mel. Yeah, look, it seems like there's a whole lot of opportunities, and every time I have a chat with someone about this partnership, people get excited. It's really easy to get people excited because there are lots of opportunities to learn from one another, and in some places perhaps to share, and even better, in places to kind of develop new understandings and ways of working and so forth together. But I think part of what this conversation demonstrates beautifully is that to do it well, it's going to require a really kind of sophisticated understanding of children, families, centres, contexts, all the way through to policy. And Mel and Fran, thank you. You've kind of seamlessly gone from in the moment with a child, with a family, right through to policy and everything in between. And I think that sort of approach is likely to put us in a good position to do some great work together. And that's what I've seen in all of the people who have expressed interest so far in terms of being part of the collaboration. And that can mean different things for different people. Some it might be interested in being kept up to date about what's happening and what's coming out of it, what's new in terms of understanding or knowledge or ways of working. Others might see an opportunity to be more directly involved, or for those they're working with to be more directly involved. So might have colleagues or members of the community joining who'd love to help address some of the questions that will emerge over the period ahead around how best to support inclusive early education, to do that in a collaborative way. And then there'll be people hopefully joining the call who are listening to this afterwards who are thinking, well, I work with, I support, I create opportunities for students to develop, as part of their professional preparation or as part of their training in different areas, and can see some opportunities. And other people will see other opportunities beyond that. Point is, there's many opportunities, but my sense is from their work together to date and kind of drawing on experience with other collaborations and partnerships, it's going to be important to step through this in a deliberate way, so that we can really tap into all the potential benefits together, the mutual benefits, and also avoid some of the common pitfalls that can come with these partnerships. So this conversation today has been in my mind, a really great first step. It's very self-indulgent when was proposed to me to do something today, I thought, well, I'd just love to mostly listen. So I hope I've done that. I've certainly learned a lot through hearing you both talk and share your perspectives and experience today. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. A reminder, there is a link at the top of the chat where if you'd like to just pop down your name and email address, we'll then be in touch with a follow-up. So we'll let you know what's going on, and then if you'd like to explore getting involved in different ways, we can do it via that channel. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to Mikala and the team, the Hopkins Centre, for organising this. The amount of work that goes into preparing these Hopkins Hours is incredible, and the level of organisation and support for all of us who are involved in actually being on the screen and so forth is huge. So thank you, Mikala, and the whole Hopkins team. Mel and Fran, thank you very much for joining today and sharing your experience. I'm loving working together and looking forward to the next steps and all of the possibilities there. And lastly, thank you very much to everybody who's joined today and everybody who'll listen to watch this recording back. Thanks for being part of this conversation, for caring about this topic and seeing all the potential for good work in this space. So I think from my view, I think we might wrap it up there, but I'll quickly check with Mikala in case there's any further messages. I can see, thank you for joining today's Hopkins Hour. We hope you found the session informative. Can I indulge a final word from Fran, final word from Mel as we wrap up? Fran, any final thoughts?
Oh, no, just thank you, David, for the opportunity. I think it's been a really interesting conversation and I'm really pleased that we had the opportunity to talk today.
Thanks so much.
All right, lovely. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely rest of today.